This is the Mooks and the Gripes podcast. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor, and with celebration in his heart, Paul. Paul, how are you doing?
I am feeling very celebratory. We're right in the heart of the holidays. It's that time of year that we always say how much we love, and so yeah, I'm feeling it.
Should I have said drunkenly, Paul? I mean, is it you feeling that celebratory, or
I don't know if I'm feeling quite that celebratory yet, especially since we usually record in the mornings. You know, it's probably best if I don't get into any of that yet. But
well, that's good to hear. You know, we'll be able to we'll be able to understand your choices today. Then.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe if we ever do Mooks and Gripes After Dark or something, then that'll be it.
Well, I'm a teetotaler, so I'll be the responsible party. I'll make sure to escort you through the whole thing. So
that's right. You can drive me home, and you can debauch on potato chips, maybe.
That's right. I'll be slovenly. Oh well, everybody, we are back. Probably don't need much of an introduction to this show because it's a part 2. But it is my favorite part 2. It's our top 5 books that we read in 2022. In case you missed it, we released part 1, which was our 10 through 6, a couple of weeks ago. And we are back now to share our top 5. We got a little tiny bit of spoiler because one of my top 6 sounds like it might be on Paul's top 5, but we'll see. We'll see if if I interpreted that correctly.
Yeah, and I wonder if we'll have any other potential matches in our top 5.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I didn't think we would have any, so this, I was surprised.
Yeah.
But why don't we start just like we did last time? We did ask a few folks if they would like to send in their picks to us, and many people recorded, just like in our 10 through 6, a little segment where they told us about their favorite book that they read in 2022. But there were a couple who sent us an email, and I want to make sure that we get theirs as well. And one of them is a fantastic librarian Twitter friend, Gavin Wolcher. And the book that he highlights here is called Bottomless Belly Button by Dash Shah. I remember him tweeting us when he read this and saying, recommended, guys, or something along those lines.
Yep.
But this is enticing. Other than, this might be right up your alley, Paul. Very dark, disturbing, bleak.
Exactly.
A behemoth at 720 pages. This graphic novel chronicles the dysfunction of the Looney family, addressing issues of divorce, uncertainty, place, personal and family history, and relationships. Shaw shows the complexities of everyday existence through deceivingly simple art and poignant messaging. There really is not a lot to cheer for in this book. You go, Paul. It won't make you feel good, Paul. It doesn't have a happy ending. Well, now you got to go out and get it. I like these kinds of things too. Yeah. And it will most likely reflect some aspects of your own family that'll make you feel uncomfortable, but it is an important read.
Sounds really good.
Thanks for sending that in to us, Gavin. And then someone who has been doing work that we all appreciate very much for weeks was working out how to get this thing recorded. We were trying to get it all ironed out, but, he's a bookseller. And as he's posted on Instagram, he's finishing up books, that he's writing himself. But we got Mark Haber, who guested with us on our episode about New Directions earlier in the year. And he still sent me what his favorite read of the year was. And he says he's cheating just a little bit because part 3 was released this year. But it's John Fosse's Septology. And that's translated by Damien Searles. He says it's not a very original choice, but just incredible and something I'll go back to again and again. So very, very happy to, I finally just told him, hey, you are doing all of our work for us,
Absolutely.
As a bookseller and as one of our favorite authors. So no need to put a lot of pressure on you, but I was glad he still sent me what his favorite read of the year was because I wanted to know. So
I am too. Yeah. And actually that, the first couple of books of that series were on my maybe pile, maybe my honorable mention
Hmm.
pile for my top 10 of the year. So I'm looking forward to reading the rest of that series and hearing people like him. And there's Merv Emery, I believe is how you say her name. She
Hmm.
has been writing some things about that for the New York Times and elsewhere that make me even more excited to read the rest of them too. She's written very well on that. So
Well, in
great.
Transit Books, for those who are interested, they've released these volumes individually, but they also just a month or two ago released a hardback that's all of them compiled together.
I know it's so tempting. I have all the Fitzcarraldo editions already, and I'm like, hmm. I've read 2 of the 7 or whatever. Surely that justifies buying 2 entire sets of it, right?
Right, exactly. It's Mark's favorite read of the year. So
I know. Yeah, he's another one like John Self who has done a lot of good damage to my bookshelves already
there you
over the
are,
years.
the good kind, the constructive deconstruction, or
That's
what
right.
destruction. All right. Well, we will come back to some more listener recordings here in just a few minutes after our numbers 4 and 5. So, Paul, let me know what your number 5 book of the year is.
All right, my number 5 book of the year is The Trouble with Happiness by Tove
Mm.
Ditlevsen, translated from the Danish by Michael Favia Goldman. I hopefully pronounced that correctly. So I know we've brought her and this book up already several times. You know, I've talked a lot about her Copenhagen trilogy, which was a series of memoirs that received a lot of acclaim and attention after they were republished. I guess it was last year. Um, and honestly, that very easily could have been on my list last year, you know,
Mm.
because those books were so amazing. But having this collection on the list for the year isn't any kind of lifetime achievement award or, you know, one of those things where I'm like putting it on there, you know, for her body of work. These stand up on their own. They are fully deserving of being on my list. So, you know, they do carry through with a lot of the same themes that were in the Copenhagen trilogy, kind of following up on maybe Gavin's uh, recommendation there. You know, there's a lot of loneliness and disappointment and the compromises that people are forced to make as they go through life. I saw someone say it's as if Ditlevsen were probing a series of aching tooth cavities. So hey, if that doesn't
Yeah,
sell you, I don't
yeah.
know what to. No, but there's one line in particular in one of the stories that stands out as kind of a good summary, and it says the most important thing is probably always precisely the thing you can't have. That's where all the happiness is. And I thought that was a pretty good summary. So I know I do tend to read a lot of passages from these books, but I personally feel like it's a good way to kind of sell them and give you a taste. So I'll just read a little bit from the opening story, which is called The Umbrella. And it really does set the stage for a lot of the other themes in the book. So it says, Helga had always unreasonably expected more from life than it could deliver. People like her live among us, not differing conspicuously from those who instinctively settle their affairs and figure out precisely how, given their looks, their abilities, and their environment, they can do what they need to do in the world. And then it skips forward a little bit. When her mother left, always just before her husband was expected home, and how Helga waved to her familiar, substantial figure for as long as she could see it, then she sat back down at the window without turning on the light. A sadness grew within her and around her. She thought, if only Egon would come home. But when he did come and filled the small room with his noisy company, every enchantment was shattered. Could it be that it wasn't him she was longing for? She walked around quietly, carrying out her housewifely duties, picked at her food like a bird, and said yes and no when her husband's remarks required an answer. Once he regarded her closely. You should have a kid, he said. I damn well don't understand why it's not happening. Then she blushed, partly at her deficiency in that department, but more because she didn't actually mind not having a child. Her togetherness with her mother allowed the child, Helga, to live on within her. So it was as if there wasn't room for another one. Sometimes she lied to Egon when he asked if her mother had been over, because for some reason he didn't like her mother to visit so often when he wasn't home. So, you know, I think between those two passages, it just gives you a really nice view into these people who are, you know, they're doing their best, but they're struggling with various things. And in this case, you know, she has some mother issues, but also her marriage is not especially happy and she's lonely. And so as the story moves along, you find out that one of the things that she has really set her heart on is this idea of purchasing a really nice, colorful umbrella. And you find out there's some connections there to some childhood memories, and there's some deeper stuff going on why that would be so important to her. But you know, she thinks that maybe it will kind of break up some of the loneliness and melancholy that she's feeling in her life. And so, you know, I was thinking about reading another passage, but I don't want to, you know, go too far into that. But I will just say that there's some really lovely passages about why the umbrella is so important to her and what it means to her. it doesn't necessarily have a happy end. Spoiler alert. So, um, these aren't happy stories clearly, but if you read a little bit about her life, she did not have a very happy life. She suffered with substance abuse and other issues. And so it's very reflective of her reality. And as we always say, I think that there's some importance to kind of looking into these parts of life that may be easier or nicer to kind of skip over. And even though they are dark, I found something from Dwight Garner in the New York Times that I really liked. It says, "It's easy to make these stories sound even bleaker than they are. Yet, as Martin Amis said, achieved art is quite incapable of lowering the spirits." And I really liked that perspective. I think it really sums up kind of why I'm drawn to a lot of these darker stories, or at least why I can still manage to, you joke about how I'm a pretty happy person, but I like to go into these books. But I do think when it comes to art and looking at some of these extremely tough topics, there's something so impactful about the way it can be done and kind of even transcendent about
Yeah.
recognizing the human condition and all of that. So that's my number 5 pick. I know that you, and I believe it was Lori Feathers, had mentioned that she really liked these stories too. So I know that these have been making their way around kind of the book universe. I believe you really like these as well.
No, I loved this collection. And it was the first thing that I've read by Tove Ditlevsen.
Mm-hmm.
I remember you talking about the Copenhagen trilogy and many others as well. And I still haven't read that. I
Yeah.
don't know why I haven't. But I started with this collection, and I started with The Umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And man, those first, even you read from like the first paragraph or so.
Mm-hmm.
I was just immediately, this is someone who knows what she's doing
Yeah.
and has something to say. And I thought it was fantastic. I loved the whole collection. And you're right. In fact, I was sitting here kind of thinking about it. Isn't it interesting that something bleak and dark can still be invigorating to the spirit in a way,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't the same as happiness or joy, but is still sublime and impressive. And I wouldn't say uplifting, but you said the right word, I think, transcendent. And it's this is a perfect example of that kind of collection that's so sad, and especially when you realize she's not just writing. I mean, the Umbrella is a little bit fantastical in a way, it's
Mm-hmm.
very strange, but she's still writing about very real things to her even.
Yeah.
And so it, I don't, it can feel a little strange to think, oh, that's so transcendent and beautiful. You had such a rough life. I'm glad I'm getting to read about it. Makes me feel
Right.
good. And I know
Right.
that's not quite the way that it is, but at the same time, that sense of transcendence, like you said, is
Mm-hmm.
is there. And yeah, a fantastic collection. Uh, Definitely a contender for to be on my list.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I am too. I wondered if that one could be a shared one. So,
It
yeah.
certainly could have been. Probably should have been, if I'm being honest.
Oh, there's
But
so many great books out there. I'm glad we're covering some different ground.
all right. Well, for me, my number 5 book, Paul, this might surprise you because it surprises me. Not that it's on my list, but that I got through this thing in time. But I spent about the last few weeks after our settling in for a long winter's read
Mm-hmm.
in this kind of place. No one understands the heart, least of all the overhanging mountains enshrouded with mists or dancing storms, which rule godlike over the narrow shores of this bleak, sea green fjord. Sullen sea breezes blow into the rickety huts in the middle of the night without a care as to whether sensitive breasts might be sleeping there. Who doesn't know the strange feeling of waking in a winter storm to cold water dripping from the sloping ceiling onto one's naked breast, then drop after drop, and it's impossible to fall asleep again? Or, it's not always winter at this fjord. You can get into spring. Looking closer, however, this could hardly be called a day, and even less spring. And if any sun had risen to begin with, it hadn't been assigned any particular task in this village, and the heavenly flowers that smelled so sweet in people's souls were at least as inconsequential a benefit as the dove playing the harp strings. The mountains were engulfed in fog, and a bleak, cold drizzle filled the air.
Mm.
But it isn't all sadness. There are some times Sunny days in the spring, and I love this part. The sunny days of spring are like will-o'-the-wisp, which tricks people. Innumerable are the stormy days and all the desperate, sleepless nights that the human heart can forget on one sunny day in springtime.
Ooh.
Anyway, Paul, I love the book Salka Valka by Halldór Laxness and translated by Philip Ruffton. This tale about a fjord in Iceland. Um, After our winter read episode, I went and started it. It's, over 600 pages long
Yeah.
and just fell right through it all. It is fantastic, better than I was even expecting. It's divided into two parts, two books, I guess. I don't know exactly what they're called. And then each of those is divided essentially in half into separate parts as well. They each have their own little title. And so every 150 pages or thereabouts, you're kind of through a new section in the book. So it just felt more bite-sized for some reason, It was interesting to see the book in that form and then make it through it in that way. But the first half or so deals with Salka Valka. She is 11 when she and her mom take a boat downstream. They're trying to reach, and I should have looked up how to say the city in Iceland, Reykjavik or something like that. I apologize. I should have done that before we started. Anyway, they're working their way down shore to get to there, but they can't make it. They have no money, and so they disembark at this little fishing village that basically everybody everybody lives off of the fishing industry here. And one man in particular runs the whole industry, and he owns the store, and so people work for him and get credit at the store, things like that. And it's just this old kind of village, this very small village. And here show up this single mom and her little daughter, Salka Valka. And the first half deals a lot with Salka Valka's childhood, those first few years with her mom in this village, and the difficulties and the culture and the religion and the men. And then the last half deals more with Salka Valka, years later when she's an adult. And it's a little bit more heavily political, trying to figure out how do we help this city survive. Is communism the way? Is some other method going to help us get through all of this? And there's more dealings with people from out of town and the like. But ultimately, it all comes down to Salka Valka, this very strong girl and then woman who is very unique. And there's a passage that I thought I would read too, about her, that's from the second part of the book when she's an adult, but you can still feel she deals with so much, and people recognize her strength, but Laxness also shows her vulnerability and some of her own sensitivity to life. She felt that those who wrote books were always thinking about themselves, not about her. It almost never happened that they took part in the pulsing in her veins. She felt as if they all considered themselves superior to her, and even wrote their most informative books for the purpose of convincing her of that. Thus, she actually knew of nothing that she felt could cut through her solitude. When she touched herself between the sheets in the evenings, she was often seized with hatred and fell asleep feeling sorrowful. And I, hesitate to say too much on, hey, this is a fantastic book about a woman's experience, because I am, a man, and so is the author here.
Right.
But there is a review in the Washington Post by Jane Smiley, who incidentally has her own new book coming out this month. I do have a copy of that, need to get to it.
Nice.
But she says, and I'll rely on her then, Laxness characters are rough and honest. Salka Valka is one of the most empathetic portraits of a girl and a woman that I've read by a male author. So there you go. We'll rely on Jane Smiley to talk about that aspect of it. But regardless, it's just a rich book about a place. I purposefully wanted to talk about the location at the beginning and that sense of just living, in this relatively brutal area of the world, where if it storms too much, your fish industry is going down, and so the weather and its you know sudden changes can be much more devastating than me, who looks outside and goes, "Oh no, is it going to be a long commute to work today?"
Right, exactly.
So,
Well,
but
that's
yes, I know you joked at the end of that episode, "Oh, maybe Salka Valka, if you can only get through it," and I didn't think that I would, but it was that kind of book that I just fell through basically.
wow, that's impressive. Well, I'm so happy you did. That's exciting. Does that type of beautiful like landscape description play a part throughout the book, or is that kind of like setting the stage for each of the sections or something? Like, what does it carry through, would you say?
It does carry through, but a lot of times it's the foundation at the beginning
Yeah.
of the chapter to help you understand where we're at in
Mm-hmm.
time, because it does move relatively quickly through time. It's not like one chapter and then the next one begins the day after or anything like that. It's usually a month or two has passed or a year, and then it's this time of year. Everybody, there's chapters at the holiday season that we're in. There's chapters at Easter. There are
Mm-hmm.
things like that throughout. So it's not like he stops very often, at least that I can remember, in the middle of chapters to really dig into the nature.
Yeah.
But it's a great taste at the beginning of not every chapter, but many of the chapters, as to this sense of place again.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Well, that makes me pretty excited. I'm so happy that you ended up liking it because it came with such high
Hmm.
expectations, and we've talked about it a lot. And like I said, the continual theme of me running out and grabbing it. But that does sound like that would be a wonderful book to read, either here as we close out the year or heading into the early part of 2023, a nice winter book.
I do recommend it as such. I read the opening
Mm-hmm.
part in that Winter Reads episode, and it's winter time in this village, in this fjord, and the sailors are all kind of talking about that. And yeah, it doesn't stay there. It's not a winter book throughout, but it's a wintry. It's Iceland,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's always
Absolutely.
winter there. The
That's right.
reindeer, that are your neighbors and such. So,
Exactly. Awesome. Well, that's a great choice. I love it.
all right.
You
Well,
ready?
what's your number four?
So my number 4 choice is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro, translated from the Spanish by Francis Riddle and published by Charco Press. So this book, you may have seen it online. It's been getting quite a bit of buzz. Back in April, it was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. So I think even before that, I was hearing a lot about it. But after that is when it really seemed to take off a little bit. So Pinheiro, she's a well-known crime writer in Argentina, and apparently she's often compared to Alfred Hitchcock. So that should appeal to some people out there. In many ways, this book, could be considered a mystery or a crime novel, but it's also a whole lot more than that. There's a lot going on. The protagonist, named Elena, is a 63-year-old woman who's suffering from Parkinson's disease. And so she, I guess, if there's a detective character in this book, she would definitely be that, because her daughter is found hanging and dead in the belfry of a church that she attends. Her name is Rita, and her death is ruled as suicide. But Elena, kind of refuses to accept that verdict, and that's kind of the driving mystery behind the book, is her unwillingness to believe that that's what's actually happened. And so she basically spends the rest of the book, on this quest to kind of find out what the truth really is. Elena, she's quite a character. She's, it's nice because she's an older character, and we've talked about that in some of our episodes, like how that's not often represented in fiction. But in addition to that, she's largely ignored or underestimated by those around her, both due to her age and to the Parkinson's disease that she suffers with. So she can often kind of pass right through a crowd and not really get noticed. But man, we get exposed to her inner, thoughts and everything, and she is a force to be reckoned with for sure. Um, Her illness has a huge impact both on the book itself, but also on the way that the book is actually structured. It's divided up into 3 sections, and they're called morning, midday, and afternoon. And the reason they're divided up that way is because this does take place in one day, but even more importantly, Elena's medication schedule is reflected in those 3 times. So basically, she must stick really closely to this schedule of medications in order to maintain even any ability to kind of be able to move through the day and maintain control of her body as she struggles with Parkinson's. So She often refers to the disease as an adversary or an intruder inside of her body. So, Pinheiro is excellent at the mystery and crime aspects of this whole thing as this quote unquote case kind of unfolds, but she's also really, really good at conveying what it's like to live in this damaged body with Elena. So I'll start reading, just from the very beginning. The book starts like this. It says, "Morning, second pill. The trick is to lift up the right foot just a few centimeters off the floor, move it forward through the air, just enough to get past the left foot, and when it gets as far as it can go, lower it. That's all it is," Elena thinks. But she thinks this, and even though her brain orders the movement, her right foot doesn't move. It does not lift up. It does not move forward through the air. It does not lower back down. It's so simple, but it doesn't do it. So Elena sits and waits. In her kitchen. She has to take the train into the city at 10 o'clock. The one after that, the 11 o'clock, won't do because she took the pill at 9. So she thinks, and she knows, that she has to take the 10 o'clock train right after the medication has managed to persuade her body to follow her brain's orders. Soon. The 11 o'clock train won't do because by then the medicine's effect will have diminished and almost disappeared, and she'll be back to where she is now, but without any hope that the levodopa will take effect. Levodopa is the name for the chemical that will begin circulating in her body once the pill has dissolved. She's known that name for a while now. Levodopa. The doctor said it, and she wrote it down for herself on a piece of paper because she knew she wasn't going to understand the doctor's handwriting. She knows that the levodopa is moving through her body. All she can do now is wait and count the streets. So that gives you an idea. I mean, it's just amazing. It's claustrophobic in a way because you can feel yourself trapped in her body, but also just things that we take for granted on a daily basis where we would just get up and go do something. For her, just to go across town, she basically has to plan it out around pills, bus schedules, how far she can walk in a given amount of time and all these things. So the reason that she's trying to figure all that out is she's setting off on this quest across the city of Buenos Aires to meet someone who she thinks might be able to help get to the bottom of things with this whole mystery surrounding her daughter's death. And so that takes up the whole book, really, except for it's balanced by some flashbacks and other insights into the backstory of her relationship with her daughter, which, again, there's a lot there, some damage and some problems. I've read some comparisons, very loose comparisons, to Homer and to Joyce, because, I think the Joyce probably comes because it's set in one city during the course of a single day. And then Ulysses, because this seemingly small quest that she sets off on has a lot in common with these epic quests just because of all the things that we just talked about. So I won't read a whole lot more, but again, just the interiority in this book is so good. And I just wanted to give one more quick taste. It says she's nervous, which isn't good because when she gets nervous, the medication takes longer to work. But she can't help it. Today's the day she's going to play her last card, to try to find out who killed her daughter, to talk to the only person in the world who she thinks she can convince to help her. So then she's talking about once she reaches this person, it's possible she won't even recognize her because of her disease or how long it's been over the years. And it says, and even if she remembers her, she won't recognize her, trapped, hunched inside a deteriorating body that doesn't match her age. It will be Elena's job to explain who she is and why she's there when she confronts Isabel. She's going to tell her about Rita and about her death. Or rather, she'll tell her the little she understands from everything they've told her. So you can see there's this it's a desperation and unwillingness to accept what everybody keeps telling her. And then that's complicated and exacerbated by the fact that she's, a senior who's dealing with some of these other problems. So it's a really, really, it's touching in a way, but she's also, she's kind of like that character that we talked about in Olga Tokarczuk's book, Drive the Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, where you find yourself rooting for her and empathizing with her, despite the fact that in many ways she's quite a handful of a person, So it's a great character. So it's such a good book. It ticks several boxes we've talked about, focusing on older characters and some of those people that society kind of overlooks and ignores. But, I know this one will probably end up on a lot of people's lists for the year based on, talking to some other people online, because it's just such a good book. So highly, highly recommended.
Well, I am very glad that that's on your list because of something that happened to me yesterday.
Oh, okay.
So, on Fridays, I do a post on Instagram that's, hey, everybody, what are you reading this weekend? And people will chime in, and then I'll post the covers and all of that. Well, somebody is reading this book, Elena Knows. And I'm pretty fast. I mean, I can get on there, see what people have written, and I know where to go to find them. I usually go to Amazon and make sure I get a good, high quality image of the book's cover. Well, yesterday my fingers were moving so fast, I hit the buy now with one click on Elena Knows, and I've been wanting to read it for a long time. It's been in, it's been in my mind, but that was not deliberate. It
Wow.
was fate.
That
So
was fate. Exactly. You didn't know I'm actually a Jedi and I use the
you
Force.
did that.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's hilarious. But that's, of all the books to do a one-click accidental buy on, that one's very high on the list. You'll be very happy, I think.
I'm excited. Well, so I read it last night, and it's my no, just kidding. Nope, I haven't read it yet, but very excited now, even more so than I was before. I knew that it sounded intriguing, but you've talked it up in a way that makes me just really anxious. Give me a good foundation for it.
Yeah, well, good.
Well, my number 4 book is a book that I think you have. I don't know if you've read it yet, but I know that you're a fan of the author. It is Ti Amo
Mm.
by Hanna Ostevik, translated by Martin Aitken. Have you read this one yet, Paul?
I have, and it very
Oh.
easily could have been on my list, and I was actually really, really hoping that it would be on yours. So I'm glad.
You know, reading through this again, sometimes at the first page you realize, oh boy, here we
Hmm.
go. And I read that first page a while back, so I won't read it again, but it's her talking about what we say when we're saying I love you kind of thing. Especially since this is a part where the narrator is talking about her husband who is dying of cancer, as she's trying to write a book, not necessarily this book. But man, this book goes deep
Mm.
and introspective, and there's a part just a few pages later before they really understand what's going on where she says, I was jealous of your pain, which mounted over the summer. You'd wander about at night in our dark, roomy apartment, moaning and whimpering. It never occurred to me that you could be seriously ill. I reasoned the pain was from keeping something inside, that you weren't happy with me anymore and didn't want the life we were living, only you couldn't bring yourself to acknowledge it and tell me. That was what I thought. Sometimes I wondered if there was someone else, and would convince myself of it, that some other woman had become the object of your desires, for you were giving so little away. The signals you sent me were so unclear. Man,
Mm.
just that tendency we have to, we've been vulnerable with this person, and these little things can become about us,
Hmm.
even though it is about her too. She's losing her spouse, her partner, and yet to almost be mistrusting of what they're going through that's causing them to kind of shut down and shut off. I just, man, gives me the chills in
Yeah.
a way that's so sad. um but I love parts too where she talks about their relationship, and this is when they're just, it's still very early in the book, like page 10. They're going to figure out what is wrong, and it says it was where they were going to find out what was wrong with you. You with whom I belong, you who make the night and the darkness our own, in our big bed, a place where I can touch you, sense that you exist and feel secure. You who are home to me, my sky. Just,
Ooh.
and again, similar to Tova Ditlevson, this is maybe autobiographical 100%. As the narrator goes on, she talks about having, gone on tour for her novel Love, and of course Hanna Orstavik is that author.
Yeah.
And she really did lose her husband to cancer a few years ago.
Hmm.
And so as the book goes on, she starts to say, so now I've decided to write this book about us and all of that. And it is very, open and honest and reflective and exploratory, very vulnerable, because she's writing about her own insecurities as she's going through this. And it's not that same, I just need to write a memorial about my spouse or something like
Hmm.
that. It's also about, man, look at all these things I feel. Look at these temptations that I've had, for not necessarily for an affair, but for companionship, when she does leave again to go out on tour and such. And her hesitancy to even write it down. We only know pages and pages and pages later that this episode happened to her, because she can't bring herself to write down that she enjoyed talking with a man while she was on tour. I loved everything about this book. Archipelago just knocks it out of the park so much with the books that they publish, the authors that they highlight, as so many other of our favorite publishers do, of course. But this is my third book from them on this list this year.
Yeah.
So, and this was a very tiny one, Salka Valka is, 620, 630 pages, and Ti Amo in its final form is right around 120 pages. So you can read it very quickly. But just such a special book, and painful.
It is. It reminds me of the discussion we had when we read our books about getting older, and how in our society there's so much focus on youth and fitness and healthiness and diet and all that stuff. And so for me, there's something, I don't know if cathartic is the right word, but when you acknowledge that these things can and do happen every day, and you kind of get a look into what it's like, even though it's painful, there's also something that's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid, or, something like that, where I really do appreciate the insights and just the spending some time in that. And obviously, it's easier when you can close the book and make it go away. But at the same time, that for a lot of people that's not possible. And I don't know, it's just when you read about age and death and some of these harder things like we keep talking about, I mean, there is something that is just, I don't know. It's one of the things that art can do that's so important, I think. And so, yeah, I'm so glad you chose that book. It's really amazing. She is such a good author. Like, I think every book that she's written has just left me completely, stunned. So
I'm excited for more. I mean, we don't have all of them in English yet, and I hope they're on their way. Because she's, every book that I've read by her too, the three, right? The Pastor, Love, and Ti Amo. I don't know if there's any others, and I don't think
believe
those
so.
are
That's the only three that
I've
I've
done.
Yeah, me too.
So more, and and we'll get more gut punches. But it does help, like you're saying. There's something about recognizing some things are very superficial that we can spend a lot of time worrying about and dealing with, and this can help kind of break away some of that to get to the heart of some things, and it can feel a great sense of gratitude at the end of these things for relationships and for what you have. And like you say, it's really nice when you can put it aside and your family and your life is still in one piece to all of that. But boy, it is still important to recognize. And but yeah, just a tremendous book. It could be all of these today could be higher on my list. So
I know, exactly.
But let's take a little bit of a break from our favorite books to listen to some of our friends who have graciously and hopefully without too much trouble sent in their recordings to us. So first, we will hear from our friend Alina Stefanescu.
I'm Alina Stefanescu, and Antonio Di Benedetto's novel, The Silenciary, has captivated me. The book itself is a sort of labyrinth of introspection where the protagonist, this man who wants to write a book, is looking for something to set it off or something to begin it. And he distinguishes at an interesting part between chosen music and imposed music, or the noise that we're forced to be a part of versus the noise that we choose to hear. This is interesting because as a writer, I think we are constantly trying to decide which noise to hear, or expecting to hear a particular noise, or waiting even for a prompt that allows us to begin the book, or in the case of this novel, the killing. Part of what has been called the trilogy of expectation, Di Benedetto's novel was translated by Esther Allen, and the translation is incredibly closely hewn, and very articulate in its silences. The afterword by Allen also references music, which I think really matters. And she sort of fleshes out how Eric Satie and John Cage, for example, are invoked in this movement towards electronic noise or static noise and various forms of silence.
So, Paul, I have read Alina's Choice, The Silenciary. I love Antonio Di Benedetto's books and can't wait until we get part 3 of this little, I'll put it in quotes, trilogy that he wrote. I know it's on its way someday down the line. I know you've read and loved Zama, but I don't think you've read The Silenciary yet. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Although again,
Right.
I keep saying I don't know why I haven't, but
yeah,
it sounds great.
It's tough to figure out which one of these to jump into
I know.
after an episode
Absolutely.
like this.
All of them.
Well, and the next one I also haven't read, but this is from my brother, Brian, who joined us. I used to be podcast partners with him, and I'm actually going up to his house for a Christmas party today. So
Nice.
I'll get to see him, but his choice is one that I haven't read. I'm anxious to see if you have, but we'll listen to him.
Well, Merry Christmas, Feliz Navidad, etc. Trevor and Paul. Hope all is going well for you guys. Trevor asked if I would just give a quick comment on a favorite read during the year. And I looked back over the books that I've read this past year, and I was a little bit disappointed. I enjoyed them all, but there weren't a lot that I just, oh man, that was awesome. I absolutely loved it. So I'm going to comment on one book that I just recently finished, and it's actually kind of one that I have wanted to read for a long time and have never picked up, and finally decided to give it a go. It was Christine by Stephen King. I read it for 2 reasons. He wrote it earlier on in his career, and I tend to like older Stephen King better than newer Stephen King. And I liked it because it was nostalgic for me. And also it's my wife's name, Christine. And I did enjoy it. It's not like it's a literary masterpiece or anything like that, but I really enjoyed getting back, kind of revisiting my youth a bit, if you will. Hope you guys have a great one. See you later.
Well, thank you, Brian. I look forward to seeing you here in a few hours. Paul, have you read Christine? That's a Stephen King book I never have read.
I was going to say,
a car just never made me feel like I needed to get haunted by it, or that I ever would. It just doesn't sound like a scary story to me.
No, I think that's exactly the same for me. I think I've read probably, well, the way he puts out books, I probably can't say this anymore. For a time there, I had read most of the books he'd put out. But not that one. And I think it's for exactly the reason that you said, like Cujo, big St. Bernard, I can get on board with that. That sounds scary, or, somebody who's stranded with a crazy fan out in the middle of nowhere. Okay. But when it comes
that's
to
going to happen to you someday.
I know, exactly. It's just bound to happen. But yeah, the haunted car thing, I'm sure that he probably pulls it off. And after hearing Brian talk about it, it does sound pretty appealing. So maybe that's one where I'll, do like an audio. I think that could be maybe a good audio listen. But
finally start filling in the backlist for you.
Exactly.
All right. Well, our next guest is Stu. Stu's another one of our very old friends from online. Early days of Twitter and all of that. I've always really enjoyed Stu from Winston's dad, Winston being his old dog. And Stu, thanks for sending us your pick. Here we go.
Hi, Trevor and Paul. This is Stu from Winston's dad. My 2 books of the year are, firstly, the Man Booker International winning Tomb of Sand by Katerina Shree. It follows an elderly lady who takes to her bed after her husband's death and slowly gets back into the world. It features a prominent trans character, some wonderful wordplay, and hopefully opens the door to more wonderful literature in translation from India. My second book is from a relatively new press in the UK, 3 Times Rebel. Nuria Bentio's Deadlands is a Falconesque story told by 13 characters following the death in a small, remote Catalan village of John, who's been shot in the back. We see the story from various angles of the family and people after his death. I love books set in villages, so this was one of my favourites of the year, if not my favourite. As the press is hoping to champion working class female voices from minority communities. It just suits my blog down to a T. Thank you very much, Trevor and Paul, for giving me the chance to talk.
Well, Paul, those are two books I have not read yet, though, of course, I've heard a lot about Tomb of Sand, want to get to it. But the other, not one that I know much about, so thanks, Stu.
Yeah, me either. Actually, I picked up Tomb of Sand recently. My understanding was that it wasn't yet available in the United States and was going to be released, but I was going through the Boulder bookstore probably a month ago, and what do I spy on the shelf but a copy? So I grabbed it immediately because it was also the really nice UK cover, which I really like.
And then on your drive home, you listened to some other podcasts and got distracted by other books.
I went from number 1 to number 423 on my list. No, it's still very high on my list, and hearing Stu's recommendation makes me want to read it again, or read it here very soon.
All right. And our next friend is Rebecca Hussey. Thanks so much. We got all the folks now from One Bright Book podcast.
I know.
So thank you, Rebecca. We're excited to hear your choice.
Hello, this is Rebecca Hussey, co-host of the One Bright Book podcast, and I'd like to recommend an essay collection by Teju Cole called Black Paper, subtitled Writing in a Dark Time. It was published in October 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. You may know Teju Cole from his novel Open City or his previous essay collection called Known and Strange Things. I worry that people may miss Black Paper because it was published by a university press and not a major publisher, but it's so good. The essays look at the relationship of art to its cultural moment, discussing artists from the past such as Caravaggio, as well as people working today. Cole is great at thinking through ethical problems and philosophical questions and how the past and present relate. He manages to look at our present moment with clear-eyed wisdom and generosity. He's such a beautiful writer. The book itself is gorgeous, with many full-color images included. I found these essays absorbing, inspiring, calming, and provoking, somehow all at once. Don't miss them.
Thanks, Rebecca. I have not read this one by Teju Cole. I've only read Open City, but I thought that was a fantastic book.
I haven't read anything. None of them.
Well, there you go. Well, I recommend Open City, and I'm glad to hear Rebecca is recommending even more of his work. I thought Open City was fantastic. It's definitely a book that I can see you getting into. And not to detract from Rebecca's, I'm going to make sure that I get to Black Paper pretty soon.
Yeah, sounds really good.
And we'll round out this particular segment with Ben O'Connell, who guested with us early on in 2022. Looking forward to hearing your choice.
Hi, Trevor and Paul. Thanks so much for asking me to participate in your year-end show. I had a great reading year, which made it tough to narrow down my selection. To make it easier on myself, I ruled out the established classics and any books you've discussed on Mooks and Gripes. 2 novels stood out from what remained: Bram Presser's The Book of Dirt and Will Weil's The Way In. I'm still sitting with Presser's novel, having only finished it earlier this week, but Weil's book has stayed with me for a few months now. I keep The Way In on the same mental bookshelf where I have Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman and Leonora Carrington's The Hearing Trumpet, although it's much newer. It came out in 2014. The protagonist, Neil Double, is a conference surrogate who experiences a professional crisis at a conference of conference organizers that precipitates revelations, both sinister and surreal, about a hotel chain that is entangled with his personal history. The Way In could have been simply weird, but Weil's is a superb stylist, and there's tremendous joy in watching him dismantle and reassemble the most quotidian, bland aspects of modern life into a keenly observed work of great depth and exceptional wit. Thanks again, guys, and Happy New Year.
All right, Ben, thank you so much. I clearly need to read The Book of Dirt since it's come up on both of these episodes now through various ways. So excited for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds really good.
All right. Well, we'll be back with some more friends here in a few minutes, but we're going to do our number 3 and our number 2. Take it away, Paul.
All right. My number 3 is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, translated. I read the Pavir and Volokhonsky edition, which I know can be a controversial choice, but I really liked it. So, every year I try to read several classics or, big great books or whatever, especially over the last few years. I've gone for maybe the great books, but I think it's so nice to sprinkle in some classics from different time periods, into my reading. And I always find it, there's always that risk of disappointment about these books that are talked up so much and have become like these pillars. But more often than not, I actually find myself, being blown away and joining the choir, singing their praises. And that's certainly the case for this one. Over the past few years, I've had this experience. I've talked about it a little bit. Don Quixote, Magic Mountain, revisiting Jane Austen this year was just wonderful. And then of course, Ulysses Proust, all these different ones where, again, there's that risk that you could be like, well, I don't know what all the hype's about, but that just doesn't seem to happen very often. Most of the time, even if I don't love it, I love it, but even if I don't, you can really appreciate why it has stood the test of time and why people still, talk about it so much. So, the Brothers Karamazov had been on my bucket list for years, ever since I read Crime and Punishment, probably, at least a decade ago. And so I was really glad to finally get to it. We brought it up a few times this year, and as I made my way through it, we chatted about it a little bit, but I just wanted to emphasize again how it's so complex, but also how modern and easy it is to read. Sometimes I think that's another risk with classics is you get intimidated and think it's just going to be a slog or really difficult. And I mean, there are sections of this where he doesn't shy away from philosophy and religion and these deeper topics, but overall I found it, it's really a page turner in a lot of ways. It's, a murder mystery. There's a courtroom drama. There's those explorations of, philosophy and religion and things like that I talk about, but they're kind of sprinkled throughout. So the pacing of it, I found, surprisingly compelling, really. Obviously it focuses on the family, the Karamazovs, but also features several love triangles, so there's no stereotypes of a dry or dusty classic here. There's got all kinds of fun stuff going on. But like I said, in addition to all the plot and the complex interactions between all the characters, there are some wonderful monologues or digressions, as there often is in Russian literature. There's Ivan's chapters about the Grand Inquisitor, which are probably some of the most famous. Or we talked a little bit in an earlier episode about the Elder and some of his, when he's holding forth to his disciples and talking. And some of those sections are so good. Here's an example of that style of the writing that I marked that I think is really good. It says, "The centripetal force on our planet is still fearfully strong, Alyosha. I have a longing for life, and I go on living in spite of logic. Though I may not believe in the order of the universe, yet I love the sticky little leaves as they open in spring. I love the blue sky. I love some people, whom one loves, sometimes without knowing why. I love some great deeds done by men, though I've long ceased perhaps to have faith in them. Yet from old habit one's heart prizes them. Here they have brought the soup for you. Eat it, or it will do you good. It's first-rate soup. They know how to make it here. I want to travel in Europe, Alyosha. I shall set off from here, and yet I know that I'm only going to a graveyard. But it's a most precious graveyard, that's what it is. Precious are the dead that lie there. Every stone over them speaks of such burning life in the past, of such passionate faith in their work, their truth, their struggle and their science. That I know I shall fall on the ground and kiss those stones and weep over them. Though I'm convinced in my heart that it's long been nothing but a graveyard. And I shall not weep from despair, but simply because I shall be happy in my tears. I shall steep my soul in emotion. I love the sticky leaves in spring, the blue sky. That's all it is. It's not a matter of intellect or logic. It's loving with one's inside, with one's stomach." And it's like, wow, it's just so good. Like, I hate to say the human condition because it sounds so corny, but it's talking about like, all these, just what it is to be a person. I love the blue sky. I love some people, but he also says like, I love them, but I might not have much faith in them. And I really liked that. It's just this acknowledgement of the world is a damaged place. You're going to get hurt, but you still find these moments of beauty and these reasons to go on. So that's what I mean about, just over the stretch of time, it's easy to think that people back then thought differently than us or, whatever. Like as a student in college, sometimes you have to kind of have this dawning that people are still the same as they've always been. And I think passages like that just go a long way toward that. So, I was really pleasantly surprised by the complexity of some of the thoughts that go into all this, and the gray areas that he introduces as well. It's not him just espousing his views and holding forth, like some people might think. So for anyone who's a fan of Russian literature and all its messy, complicated glory, I think this is a great choice for those who haven't read it. So yeah, I was absolutely thrilled that I finally got to it, and was happy to see that it not only held up to, but exceeded even what I was expecting. So
Excellent.
I know it's a favorite of yours, or at least one that you've really enjoyed reading.
Yeah, well, and I read it over 20 years ago now. And so I remember a lot of it quite well, and other things I have no idea
Yeah.
what I've forgotten even. But the thing that's disturbing to me is when you started reading it, I thought, oh, I'm going to go find my old copy. I had that like purple Bantam Classics copy that I loved. I toted that around England with me while I was reading it. I wrote in it, I put where I was when I finished it, at the end
That's
of it, and the
cool.
date. I can't find it.
Oh,
So I'm
no.
really kind of sad. I don't know if I got rid of it one day thinking, oh, it doesn't really matter or not. And it doesn't. But at the same time, I kind of, when you got to it, I thought, I'll pull it out and see what passages I highlighted, just kind of see if that refreshes things. But I do remember, picking it up and thinking, I'll just give this a go tonight, see how it feels. And all of a sudden I'm 50, 60 pages in, because you're getting to know these raucous characters and this horrible man and, this father, and boy, it was exciting. I loved it from page one.
Yeah.
And was swept away by it.
Exactly. I know every one of the brothers is so unique, and you kind of get these little or sections of the book that focus on the different ones. And as happens with a good book, you're always sad when it switches perspectives, because you were getting so attached to hearing about that character. But then it doesn't take long before you're fully enmeshed with the next one and you're on board again. And it's just amazing the power of that book, and how human, like I said, I think that's what it is. Like, they all represent different parts of humanity in some ways, but the overall package of just all the complexity and messiness of being a human, I think, is one of the things I really liked about it.
Well, I realized something just now that also I wish I hadn't, but I read that half a lifetime ago for me. I read it in 2001, because I remember, again, I was on a trip to England, and so I remember it was spring of 2001. I was 21, just about to turn 22, and now I am 42, about to turn 43 this upcoming year. And so that was half a lifetime ago. Certainly, I'm probably equipped for a reread, and I would love to do that sometime. So
that's a great idea and a great point, because that is one of the amazing things about not just classics, but any book, but especially classics, reading them at different stages of your life. Just like we said, when I read Jane Austen this year, after I hadn't read some of those since college, you still appreciate them, but in very completely different ways. You connect with different characters, different passages stand out to you. So that would be a fun project if you decide to do it.
Yeah, someday I would like to. Can't after I read all the other books that came up on this episode, but maybe not too. Who knows? Who knows? All right. Well, my number 3 is one that I think you're looking forward to reading sometime soon. It is Anthony Trollope's Barchester Towers. I love these books. The next one for me is Dr. Thorne. I haven't started it yet, but I can't wait, because I just love this world, and I love Trollope's narrator, who is someone who feels it's his responsibility to be fair to his characters. He will admit sometimes when he doesn't like them, but he'll also talk about his own, just this is the omniscient narrator, his own, senses. And there's one part at the beginning. I don't want to spoil this too much for you. So this is on page 14.
Okay.
But it is kind of a spoiler. You remember our protagonist of The Warden, Septimus Harding, and how he had the daughter, Eleanor, who was married to John Bold, who was kind of the troublemaker of that first novel. Not for doing anything wrong, but he's the one who thought there shouldn't be such a lucrative job as the warden in that book. Well, at the very start of this one, Eleanor is a widow. John has died, and it's not long after the warden, so he dies young.
Wow.
And I love the way he talks about her. This is the narrator. This isn't Septimus. This isn't, anybody else that's in this book other than, someone who can see everybody. It says, "Poor Eleanor Bold. How well does that widow's cap become her, and the solemn gravity with which she devotes herself to her new duties. Poor Eleanor. Poor Eleanor. I cannot say that with me John Bold was ever a favorite. I never thought him worthy of the wife he had won, but in her estimation he was most worthy. Hers was one of those feminine hearts which cling to a husband, not with idolatry, for worship can admit of no defect in its idol, but with the perfect tenacity of ivy. As the parasite plant will follow even the defects of the trunk which it embraces, so did Eleanor cling to and love the very faults of her husband. He is so good at these little passages. And similar to, say, George Eliot in Middlemarch, there's this whole community, and you get to where you love and, kind of hate certain characters. And then he does things like this. Remember in Middlemarch where, you just hate Casaubon with good reason. But there's just the part where she takes you to his place in the evening, late at night, when he's alone and dealing with his own fears, insecurities, loneliness, existence. And it doesn't make you like, oh, I actually love this guy and everything he does is fine. It's just like, oh, wow, there's another human heart beating here.
Yeah.
And some of it's very recognizable. Trollope just does that with these books that make you love every character to one degree or another. And you get to, it's so fun. Again, I told you this when I was reading it. I don't understand why anybody would say don't read The Warden first. First off, it's a fantastic book. Why not read one of this amazing book, The Warden? But it's absolutely important to this book. These are the same characters, I thought you'd go to some other corner of the town and deal with completely different characters, but you start with Bishop Grantley, or Archdeacon Grantley, who wants to become the bishop. We've dealt with him in the last book. Septimus Harding is wandering around with him at the start, and he's a central character. Here's Eleanor. How would you even know who John Bold is or what kind of role he played if you hadn't read that book? So yes, no one skipped The Warden again, because it's amazing, but also it's these books, read them in order. We always kind of thought, well, how do I even start these? And I think that's because people say, oh, I just started with Framley Parsonage or something like that. And sure, I'm sure you loved it. And I'm sure that's not you didn't necessarily need everything to enjoy it. But my word, what a rich community we've got here. So, yes.
That's awesome. I'm so glad it made it onto your list. I was hoping it did. Because last year, I know The Warden was in your top 5, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 2 years in a row, top 5.
We'll see if Dr. Thorne can live up to its reputation. For me.
That's right. Something tells me you might be pretty safe, but we'll have to see.
We'll see. It might fall off a cliff with that.
That's right. Jump the shark.
All right. What's your number 3, Paul? Well, or sorry. What's your number 2, Paul? We're moving through this.
We are. So I was so happy to hear that Drifts and The Birds both made your end of year lists, just because they're ones that I had talked about and kind of recommended to you. And I'm happy to say that a book that you recommended to me made its way all the way up to number 2 on my list as well. So some of our listeners are probably sick of hearing us talk about Loren Eiseley, but
I type it in the show notes every week.
Exactly, just automatically. Yeah. Loren Eiseley's collected essays on nature and the cosmos, and specifically volume 1 is the one that I'm going to touch on. So, I'll try to do what you did for me, Trevor, and win them all over, even though I keep talking about this over and over again. There's a reason for it. So, as is my annual tradition, I'm cheating a little because technically this is, I'm including this entire volume of this 2-volume set published by Library of America. And it does include several collections of essays: The Immense Journey, The Firmament of Time, The Unexpected Universe, and then Uncollected Prose. So on one of our earlier episodes this year, you read an excerpt from his essay, The Slit. And that's where he's kind of climbing down through this, gaping hole in the earth, or a crack or whatever, and comes across an ancient skull, and he starts to kind of think about what that means in as far as like time and evolution and everything. And that piece is in The Immense Journey, I believe, which contains several of my very favorite essays in all of these collections. But what continually amazed me as I read through these was just how diverse and rich they were, and how many different topics he's able to write about, and the different styles that he can adapt. He's just such an amazing writer. Sometimes if you think of somebody who's a scientist, maybe at least in my stereotypical mind, I might think, it's a little dry and dusty, but the content itself is fascinating or something like that. But no, this guy has it all. I found an excerpt from a review by a woman named Deb Derrick, and she says, "I often wonder as I sit down to read any Lauren Isley book, which Isley will be there to greet me. Will it be Isley the forsaken child, Isley the teacher, or Isley the wandering philosopher? Who indeed is Lauren Isley? A, quote, imaginative naturalist, according to the cover of his book, The Immense Journey, an anthropologist, a scholar, a poet, a genius. Isley wears all these hats. He's the teacher who backs away from the podium after an engaging lecture to make a quick dash for his office. He's a member of the expedition who hunts for bones, sleeping by the blazing campfire at night. Indeed, what makes Isley so fascinating is that he is a complex and multifaceted individual. But it is Isley the storyteller, the consummate raconteur, whom I most want to read when I'm curled up with a book for the evening." And I just really liked that. That really sums it up nicely. You get insights into all these different parts of his life, like this Indiana Jones type, maybe not that, but like he's out in the field, like she said, sleeping by the fire and digging around in the dust. And sometimes he's like giving these, talks from a podium that we end up, getting little excerpts of here. So such a wide range of topics and styles. And he does look at these huge, things like evolution and time and the universe. But I especially loved his ability to help you kind of see the world in different ways. So sometimes that's looking at something enormous, like geological time, but other times the focus was really small. And one of my favorite essays in this whole thing was called The Judgment of the Birds. I don't know if you remember that one, but I'll just read a quick excerpt. It says, "New York is not, on the whole, the best place to enjoy the downright miraculous nature of the planet. There are, I do not doubt, many remarkable stories to be heard there, and many strange sights to be seen, but to grasp a marvel fully it must be savored from all aspects. This cannot be done while one is being jostled and hustled along a crowded street. Nevertheless, in any city, there are true wildernesses where a man can be alone. It can happen in a hotel room, or on the high roofs at dawn. One night, on the 20th floor of a midtown hotel, I awoke in the dark and grew restless. On an impulse, I climbed upon the broad, old-fashioned window-sill, opened the curtains, and peered out. It was the hour just before dawn, the hour when men sigh in their sleep, or, if awake, strive to focus their wavering eyesight upon a world emerging from the shadows. I leaned out sleepily through the open window. I had expected depths, but not the sight I saw. I found I was looking down from that great height into a series of curious cupolas or lofts that I could just barely make out in the darkness. As I looked, the outlines of these lofts became more distinct because the light was being reflected from the wings of pigeons, who, in utter silence, were beginning to float outward upon the city. In and out through the open slits in the cupolas passed the white-winged birds on their mysterious errands. At this hour, the city was theirs, and quietly, without the brush of a single wingtip against stone in that high, eerie place, they were taking over the spires of Manhattan. They were pouring upward in a light that was not yet perceptible to human eyes, while far down in the black darkness of the alleys it was still midnight. As I crouched half asleep across the sill, I had a moment's illusion that the world had changed in the night, as in some immense snowfall, and that if I were to leave, it would have to be, as these other inhabitants were doing, by the window. I should have to launch out into that great bottomless void, with the simple confidence of young birds reared high up there among the familiar chimney pots and interposed horrors of the abyss. I leaned farther out. To and fro went the white wings, to and fro. There was no sounds from any of them. They knew man was asleep, and this light for a little while was theirs. Or perhaps I had only dreamed about man in this city of wings, which he could surely never have built. Perhaps I myself was one of these birds, dreaming unpleasantly, a moment of old dangers far below as I teetered on the window's ledge. Around and around went the wings. It needed only a little courage, only a little shove from the window ledge to enter that city of light. The muscles of my hands were already making little premonitory lunges. I wanted to enter that city and go away over the roofs in the first dawn. I wanted to enter it so badly that I drew back carefully into the room and opened the hall door. I found my coat on the chair, and it slowly became clear to me that there was a way down through the floors, that I was, after all, only a man. Wow. Like, when I read that, I was just blown away. That's fairly early in the first book, and that's where I started to realize what he was capable of. Because, I mean, yes, there's some science there, but that's just great writing. I mean, that particular passage is more about things that are not what you would normally consider to be like scientific writing. So anyway, that, I know that was a little long, but to me, that just sums up what I love about him. You know, I've talked about this with Robert McFarlane, that ability to find beauty in nature in unexpected and maybe even urban places, which is a skill that, given the way our world is going, is going to be increasingly valuable, as these wild places kind of shrink. So something like that that's set in the middle of Manhattan, but he still finds this magical moment, I thought was just really amazing. So like I said, there's all kinds of variety in these books, and I'm really looking forward to reading the second volume. I don't know if I'll do it in the coming year or if I'll savor it for a little while, but I can't believe I have a whole nother book of these to look forward to. They're amazing. So thanks again for the recommendation.
You betcha.
Right.
I'm glad that you got through them and found the treasure that I found in them, for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you're able to take some time with it on here. I'll be brief on my next one because I've talked about it quite a bit already in a few episodes in the past. So I don't need to take too long. Plus, I've, as I said before, I can't find any passages that would be appropriate to read.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Percival Everett's The Trees. Again, I talked about this, I know, on our episode about book prizes with Lori Feathers, and I think I talked about it on a few other ones. This is a very uncomfortable book because it's dealing with something horrific in our past. It deals with it in kind of a grotesque and potentially exploitative way. I know people who are very angry at the direction that Everett takes the Emmett Till murder, at least by the way that it looks at the beginning. This is a book where we go back down to the same community where Emmett Till was murdered back in the 50s, and he brings us up to date when their murderers, their descendants, are being murdered. And when they find that person's body, they also find the body of a black boy next to them, which they think is Emmett Till. And so, yeah, it's grotesque, it's horrific, and yet he writes it with a tone that's humorous, very disconcertingly. It's almost like the Coen brothers kind of stuff. It's horrific, but there's humor as he explores the stereotypes and treats them as stereotypes, these people. And it can be tough to find the wavelength that I think Everett is writing on, because he's not just being irreverent. He is being irreverent, but there's a really good purpose for that. And it is a very serious book. You talked about in Dasa Derndich's Trieste the several pages of names. Well, he has the same thing in The Trees. There's a chapter that goes on for pages of lynching victims and where they were murdered. Most of them, black men and women and children in the South. But then you start to spread and you see Asian names crop up in places where you and I live, So as Everett is going through this, and everybody can kind of, get a sense, well, I wasn't there, for us, it's like, well, that's a different part of, the country, a different part of history. And then he continues to pull you in as a problem, as someone complicit in all of this. He doesn't let you escape. And it is an amazing, horrific, funny, but sad and serious novel. And I think one of the most important ones I've read in a very long time. And as I said, makes me want to go and read everything else he's written, which I hear is sometimes, on similar themes, but also quite different. I did read Dr. No, which just came out. And some of this is there and some of it isn't, but I still think The Trees is, masterful. And I'm glad that that's where I started with his work, because it is fantastic.
I actually ended up listening to this book within the last month or so, based on, largely based on your talking about it. And yeah, I think you did a great job of summarizing a book that's really hard to summarize, because you kept throwing out different adjectives about it and they're all accurate. And even though some of them seem like they're polar opposites,
Or pejorative.
Or pejorative. It's all true. I mean, it is just a very complicated. And what you said about the wavelength is very true, because there were points in the book where I was like, what is he doing? You know, I couldn't quite get a feel. And then all of a sudden it would click. Oh, okay. I think I got it. And you would get carried away again. So what you said about the names was really important, because I thought the same thing as I was listening to this list of names. Hearing it on audio was probably a different experience in some ways than reading it. And like you said, you could tell that a lot of it happened in the past, but then all of a sudden I started recognizing some of the names, and you realized not only was it including lynching victims, but there was also near the end Trayvon Martin and some of these people who had been killed.
Yeah, as he pulls it in,
Matthew
closer
Shepard,
to
I believe.
us.
Yeah, exactly. So what you said is exactly right. He doesn't let anybody feel comfortable. He pokes at stereotypes across the board. You know, there's people wearing red hats that he'll poke fun at, or not even fun, but just, you know, take issue with. But then he also takes issue with other people that might be on the other end of, you know, a spectrum from them. So yeah, I'm really glad. I mean, that's deserving for sure of a mention in this list, because it's like you said, important.
Yeah. Well, let's step back just a second again and cool down. Yeah. So we let our listeners and friends join us again. We will start with Simon Thomas. Simon, take it away. Let us know what your book of the year is.
Hi, this is Simon from the podcast To Your Books and the blog Stuck in a Book. And sometimes people ask me why I keep books on my shelf for so long if I've not read them. Like, if you've got a book there for 15 years, surely you're never going to read it. Well, one of my absolute favourite reads this year had been on my shelf for 15 years, and I finally read A Jest of God by Margaret Laurence from 1966. I'm sure it's well known and loved by all the Canadian listeners. For people who don't know, it's set in a small town in Manitoba. It's about a school teacher who has an unhealthily dependent relationship with her mother. Rachel is her name, and she has been there in that town her whole life. She teaches at the school where she used to be a child. She doesn't have any much romantic interest in that town. She just doesn't see any hope. And then into that world comes Nick, a man she knew back when she was a child. I'm not going to spoil too much, but it's not a romantic, flimsy novel, and not everything goes well. But it's perfectly observed, an absolute delightful book, but only about 200 pages and absolutely worth reading.
Thanks so much, Simon. And yeah, Paul, we have our episode on books that have been sitting on your shelf for far too long. Simon's a good, gave us a good case for keeping them around.
Yes, he did. He always does.
So next, we'll hear from Jackie Wine, who joined us to talk about hotel novels a while back. Thanks for joining us again here, Jackie. Here you go.
One of my favourite reads this year was a book called A Helping Hand by the English writer Celia Dale. It's an old book, originally published in 1966, but recently reissued in a stylish new edition by Daunt Books in the UK. Now, if I had to position it in terms of genre, I would probably describe this as domestic horror, the type of story where sinister activities take place behind the veil of net curtains in the privacy of the protagonist's home. And without wishing to give too much away in terms of plot, it's an icily compelling tale of greed and deception, stealthily executed amidst carefully orchestrated conversations and endless cups of tea. In essence, the plot revolves around an outwardly respectable middle-aged couple, Maisie and Josh Evans, who take under their wing an elderly lady named Mrs. Fingal. Now, Maisie is a former nurse and Josh seems equally attentive, so at first sight the Evanses seem ideally placed to take care of Mrs. Fingal. However, once the story gets going, the reader soon realises that something very sinister is afoot. One of the things that Dale does so well here is to let the reader in on the true horror of what's unfolding. So she drops a little word here and another little hint there, such that it's all very cleverly done. So in summary then, if you're a fan of Patricia Highsmith or Shirley Jackson, this is a book for you.
Oh, Jackie's always got a lot of recommendations that I feel I need to get to much sooner than I'll probably be able to. But
I know. And as is usually the case, people are adding so many books that I have not even had on my radar, which is a wonderful thing.
Next, we'll hear from Roz Pandit. At least that's how I know her name from, Twitter and Instagram. And I always love seeing what she's reading. And here's her book of the year.
Hello everyone. A big thank you, Trevor and Paul, for inviting me to speak on your wonderful podcast. A brief intro about me. I am Radhika Pandit from Mumbai, India. I am an avid reader. You will find me on Twitter as Rads Pandit. But I also have my own blog called Radhika's Reading Retreat, where I regularly write about books. So the book I'm going to talk about today is Time the Present by the American author Tess Lessinger, an absolutely brilliant collection of short stories and easily one of the highlights of my reading this year. This title is published by Boiler House Press under its excellent Recovered Books imprint. So these stories are largely set in the 1930s, a period of great turmoil in America. The country was grappling with the Great Depression. There was also the grim prospect of the Second World War looming large. And the sheer variety of themes on display is astonishing. Schlesinger talks about marriage, relationships, unemployment, class differences, racial prejudice. In fact, there's also a story that highlights America's consumerist corporate culture. To me, the real strength of this collection is the way she depicts the economic perils and complex social issues of her time and how they had a big impact on marriages and relationships. So this collection has 19 stories. As I said, they were written mostly in the 1930s, but there's a timeless quality to them. They're astute, tragic, perceptive, all at the same time. There are two stories that particularly stood out for me. One is Friedman's Annie, an incisive tale of class differences and manipulation, and the other is Mrs. Flinders, a scalpel-like, hard-hitting tale of an abortion and how it sets in motion the unraveling of a marriage. Really, really superb stuff.
Yeah, another that I didn't know anything about before now.
but they're all so good at selling them. So yeah, that sounds great.
I know.
Thank you so much.
And last, we'll hear from Nancy Pearl, who joined us to talk about the magic of libraries. I know Nancy has a choice that Paul will feel very happy about.
The book that I want to recommend is one of those books that I think appeals to a wide variety of readers, people looking for fast-moving stories, people looking for great characters, people who want to be there, and the writing is pretty good. This book won the Pulitzer Prize. What is this book? It's Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. And for me, what I got out of it, Larry McMurtry wanted to demythologize the West, and instead he I read this somewhere, he remythologized it with the two main characters in the book, ex-Texas Rangers, good friends Woodrow Call and Gus McCrae. And those are two characters who, once you read this book, you will never, ever forget them. They will just remain as part of you. So that's Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry.
Oh, thanks so much, Nancy. And Paul, you agree? You like that she talks about Lonesome Dove again?
Yeah, like I needed to like Nancy Pearl more. She had to throw that into the mix. Yeah, she's just raised to a whole new level. Amazing.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks so much for joining us to, inundate people with book recommendations and get us all excited for the year that's passed as well as the year that's coming with more great reads on the horizon. But here's the pressure, Paul. I know what your number one is because I think we spoiled it.
We did, but yeah, that's okay. For anybody who's been following along, it's like poker where you start counting the cards and figuring out which ones haven't been played yet. Yes, it is The Birds by Tarjei Vesaas, who I still can't say his name, translated from the Norwegian by Michael Barnes and Torbjørn Stoverud. You did a great job of describing this book. And I had even considered, we often try to touch on different books and not, hit on the same stuff over and over again. And I contemplated after it was number 6 on your list, whether I would want to swap something else in, but not only did I decide to keep this in my top 5, I just could not justify it not being my top book of the year. I just love it so much. We were talking about how I could hardly believe that I'd read it last year, and I think that's partially because I feel like it's already become like one of those foundational books in my life. And so in a lot of ways, it feels like I've always known about it, even though it turns out I read it only about a year ago. So, I've talked about it here. I've talked about it on Sean Mooney's Bite-Sized Book Chats. We talked about it on our Archipelago discussion with Tess Lewis, so I keep evangelizing about it. And I know some people are probably sick of hearing me talk about it, but I can't help it. It's so good. What you mentioned about the characterization and the beauty of the writing, I think, is what really stands out to me. I think Matisse is, I don't know, he's got to be one of my favorite characters that I've ever come across in literature. He is so unique, and the way that the author writes him, where you get these insights into his mind and the way that he sees the world, is just so beautiful. And you touched on something that I really liked, where this could have turned into something different, where the townspeople or his sister, it could have turned into something where they were just always mocking him. But it's realistic and it's not schmaltzy, but there's a kindness, or at least a willingness to try to reach out and have people understand him, that I really appreciated. And so just real quickly, I'm going to read one more section. You read a section that kind of gave a little bit of insight into some of that, but this is just where he is starting to come to this realization that things might be changing. He's trying to grasp what that means in his life. And he says, he would have to pretend he wanted to make a trip to the store. He made trips there more often now. Since his great moment on the pier recently, he walked calmly into the store in front of everybody in a way he'd never done before. So he'd had these experiences lately that just made him feel like he's starting to change as a person. For all he knew, he was a respected man now. Rowing up with a girl like this had really been a tremendous success. So one afternoon he asked, "Do you want me to go and do any shopping today?" He'd even shaved. "You're a changed person these days," said Haga, "always pestering me about going to the store." He didn't protest. She had no idea what the real reason for his trip was, that it was a matter of life and death. "But what about money?" he said, feeling rather small. She found some money for the shopping and a little bit extra for Mattis. "Thank you." "I don't want any candy this time," he said quickly, "if that's what you're thinking." "Why not? We're no worse off now than we've been before." "But how can you think about candy when lightning shatters the treetops?" said Mattis, succeeding in touching briefly on the secret topic, but it had no effect on Haga. So I should have given a little backstory. There's these 2 aspen trees that are paired, and he named them after him and his sister, and he has this like almost spiritual attachment to them, and one of them was struck by lightning, and this has kind of like shattered his worldview, or at least caused him to question, what does that mean in this bigger sense? And so he's going to the store, he wants to go check out these trees, but then he's also like been enjoying going to the store more because he's feeling like there's this different side of him that's starting to emerge. "Surely there are more important things to think about now. I thought you'd understand that too." "Take the money," Matisse said, Haga, unmoved. "Buy yourself some candy, the same as you've always done." "Be careful," said Matisse in great agitation, and he left the extra money behind on the table, so that he had just enough with him to pay for the serious item. He had to get away before she frightened him even more. What he wanted was a good excuse for walking along the main road, and perhaps meeting some of his nearest neighbors. They would be bound to know more about the 2 treetops than anyone else. The storekeeper lived a little too far away to know which one was which. Matisse had to find out who had been hit. And so I could go on, and I don't know that I did a great job of laying that out. I should have explained the backstory a little bit more. But to me, it's just this idea of watching his inner growth and his search for truth. And sometimes it's in these obscure things like lightning striking a tree, but also his ways of trying to relate to the people around him. He ends up going to the store there, and he'd always gone in for candy. That's why she gave him the money. But this time he has this more, as he sees it, a more important kind of adult mission. But the part that I thought was kind of heartbreaking and poignant about that whole scene is he goes and he does what he thinks he needs to do, but then they offer him some candy, and he takes not 1 but 2 pieces and eats them on the way out. So even though he is trying to, in his mind, make these strides towards being more mature, or taking care of his sister and everything, there is still the true sense of him as this person who is innocent and takes simple pleasures in these things around him. So, as is so often the case, it's sometimes hardest to talk about the books you love the most. And I don't know that I've done a good job, but hopefully cumulatively between your great description last week, my stumbling version today, and all the other times I've talked about it, people can get some idea of just how much I love this book. And I'm looking forward to reading more from this author. I have 2 of his other books that I'm looking forward to digging into soon. So that's my top book of the year.
Me too. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my top book of the year will take us back to the beginning of the episode where I started with reading a little bit about Mark Haber's favorite book of the year. Well, Mark showing up again, I thought that St. Sebastian's Abyss was tremendous. I thought it was funny. I thought that its exploration of friendship was poignant, and I thought it was sad. It's a book about old age as well, that deals with so much of a life and this life of friends who have been together on so many things, but also competitors because they're in the same field of study. They're both scholars of art and art history, and in particular of this painting, St. Sebastian's Abyss by Count Hugo Beckenbauer. And it's about that they dedicated their whole lives to these things, and then wondering at the end of it all, what have we done kind of thing. And it's told from the perspective of one of them who is traveling by plane from New York all the way over to Berlin because his friend Schmidt, whom he hasn't talked to in a long time, is dying and said, you need to come and see me on my deathbed. So he's going. And it's these very short, frenetic, because he's agitated. He both wants to see his friend, you get the sense anyway, and doesn't. And of course, the doesn't is what really pops out in the text. It's what's on the surface and what he's talking about. And, it's about him kind of rehashing their years together, their feud, his righteousness, his right position on so many things, and his friends' selfishness and foibles and problems. And as you go through these very short little sections, you just build up this whole idea of who this person is. Not necessarily do I feel we get to know Schmidt very well, because that's not the point. We're seeing the narrator really, really kind of digging in and dealing with things. So yeah, St. Sebastian's Abyss. I know I read a little part that was funny when we had Simon Thomas on, because he's talking about, American criticism and our, things like that. And I thought that was a lot of fun, but it's a really excellently written book. It just, you fall through each of these little sections because they're like Cesar Ira or Thomas Bernhard. They're ranty at times. They're fast paced. They repeat. You get the sense that this is someone who's just circling around in their mind over one topic. They're obsessed. They can't get through it. They can't process it very well. And it's really an excellent book and a great companion piece to his debut novel, Reinhardt's Garden, that came out a few years ago. And, delighted to see him posting on Instagram about a forthcoming novel. I think it looks like it might be called Ada, just from the, from what he posted. But
the little teaser he posted,
yeah.
I know. I can't either. I'm so glad that several of the books on your list were ones that were very easily could have and probably should have been on mine. So that is a wonderful choice. And like you said, I love both of the books that he's published so far, and I'm so anxious to see where he goes next, because he has such a fascinating mind, and I just love the way that Mark, the characters he creates and their ways of looking at the world is just so fascinating.
Yeah, and such a friendly, jovial voice. Again, the bookseller who is out doing so much work at this time of year in particular, and every time that I'm communicating with him, there's just a joviality. And, just thanks for all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for your passion for reading and your great taste. I mean, like I've said before, he has some of the most wonderful book recommendations that of anyone I've ever talked to. So yeah, he's just a great all around guy.
Yeah. All right, Paul, here we are, another year with a capstone on it. And very nice to spend all of it, every few weeks recording with you about books and to recollect and reflect on these things. And I'm looking forward to 2023.
I am too. I can't wait to keep it going. Thank you so much for everything. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, listeners, again, for all of your support and the fun conversations that we've had throughout the year. I hope you are having a wonderful holiday season. This is coming out right between Christmas and New Year's. So Happy New Year, everybody. We will see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mooks and the Gripes podcast. You can follow the Mooks and the Gripes and get show notes and book and film reviews at mooksandgripes.com. On Twitter, you can find Trevor at Mooks and Paul at BiblioPaul. You can also get information about future shows on our Patreon. If you'd like to donate to the show, anything and everything, even $1 a month, helps and is deeply appreciated. You can become a patron at patreon.com/mooks. Until next time.